The skull had been in the ground for 300 years. When scientists finally opened the tomb in 1901, the body was weirdly intact. Clothes, bones, everything. But where the nose should have been, there was just a bright green stain burned into the bone. And the more they looked at it, the more they realised. That stain was evidence. A 300-year-old piece of evidence about who this man really was. His name is Tycho Brahe, and his story is the story of the most expensive, most elaborate, most completely unhinged act of vanity in the history of science. First things first, Tycho Brahe is one of the most unhinged figures in the history of science, and I'd say that's a pretty competitive field. Born in 1546 in Denmark, Tycho was a nobleman and one of the greatest astronomers of the pre-telescope era. His star charts were so accurate that Johannes Kepler, his apprentice, used them decades later to figure out how planets actually moved around the sun, not the Earth. Okay, not just Kepler, several others, and Copernicus had come first, but his charts were fundamental to proving this. Although he himself did not believe that the Earth went around the sun. He believed that all the other planets did, he just thought the Earth was a special one. He was wrong, but hey. But apart from that, he was genuinely brilliant. Really one of the most important scientists who ever lived, but also completely and utterly bonkers. As the story goes, he kept a pet elk, and said elk died after getting into the beer at a party and falling down a flight of stairs. He later bragged to people about this himself. Of course, he hosted lavish banquets, and he had a dwarf court jester named Jep who kept under the table who Tycho believed had psychic powers. And of course, Tycho had his nose. When he was the ripe old age of 20 years old, he got into an argument with a man named Manderup Parsberg, another nobleman, over a mathematical formula. Yeah, a maths argument at a party. He sounds like me arguing about history with anyone who will listen. Manderup and Tycho decided the only reasonable way to settle this was a sword duel. At night, because that's how 16th century nerds handled peer review, apparently. And spoilers for everyone, Tycho lost the tip of his nose. Manderup took it clean off. And so, one of the greatest minds of the Renaissance era lost parts of his face because he couldn't let a mass disagreement go at a dinner party, which honestly is very relatable. But the interesting thing is, Tycho didn't just accept a life of looking different, he decided he would solve his latest problem scientifically. And that solution is what left a green stain on his skull 300 years later. Losing part of your nose in the 1500s was not like losing it today. There was no reconstructive surgery, there was no universal healthcare, you just had to figure it out. And what Tycho figured out was, it had to be made from metal. So Tycho commissions a prosthetic nose made using the lost wax process, a casting technique normally used for fine sculpture and jewellery. They make a wax model first, then replace it with a metal alloy. The nose was then painted with oil paint to match his skin tone. Now, the legend, and it is a great legend, is that Tycho had multiple noses. A practical one for everyday wear, a gold one for banquets. Because of course he did. I'm surprised he would have stuck to two, to be honest. Different sources mention copper, gold, and silver alloys, which is where that story comes from. And it fits the man's reputation perfectly. We'll come back to what the nose was actually made of, because it turns out someone eventually properly checked, with real chemistry. And the answer is way more interesting than the legend itself. What we do know for certain is how it was attached. A sticky substance. Basically a medical grade glue that Tycho carried around in a small box wherever he went. Imagine that. One of Europe's most celebrated scientists at a royal banquet, excusing himself to re-glue his nose. But as DIY as all of this sounds, the nose was amazing. The lost wax process produced incredibly fine detail. This wasn't a rough, homemade job. This was a precision piece of manufacturing. So Tycho walked around 18th century Europe with a handcrafted metal nose glued to his face, painted to match his skin, and it seems he carried himself like a man who had absolutely nothing to be embarrassed about, which is the kind of confidence we should all aspire to. The nose served him well in life, but in death, it became the most interesting thing about him, because of what it left behind. Fast forward to 1901 in Prague. A team of Czech researchers opens the tomb of Tycho Brahe, who had been buried there since 1601, 3 centuries earlier. What they found was very interesting. The well-preserved body of Tycho was right there, his clothing was still recognisable. For a 300-year-old corpse, he was holding up pretty well. But Tycho Brahe's nose, the famous nose, was gone. The prosthetic had either been removed before burial, fallen away over the centuries, or some other fate had befallen it. But to this day, we still don't know which of those happened. What was there, though, was something nobody had quite expected. There was a narrow, curved mark around it, burned into the bone itself. a bright green stain right where the prosthetic nose would have sat. In other words, the nose had lain against the bone for long enough to leave its own ghost behind. And to be fair to the 1901 team, this was forensic observation, not forensic science as we'd recognise it today. They saw the stain, they drew a reasonable conclusion, and they moved on. The actual chemistry would have to wait. And it waited 109 years. In 2010, researchers exhumed Tycho's remains again, this time with modern equipment. The result? Equal parts copper and zinc. Not gold, but brass. And so the mystery of the nose wasn't just a visual guess anymore. Modern forensics had read it and named the metal. The everyday nose, the one Tycho wore most of his life, was brass. Practical, durable, relatively affordable. The gold nose for Banquet's story is a great story, but the chemistry says brass. And in a strange way, that's way more interesting. The man who performed his wealth and status at every opportunity was walking around with a brass nose under the paint. The 2010 exhumation didn't just settle the nose question, it also settled something people had been whispering about for 400 years. How Tycho actually died. This is a man who took the most precise measurements in Europe by day and took life advice from a psychic under his table by night and saw no contradictions in it. Different times, eh? Anyway. We've covered the nose, but we should probably talk about how Tycho actually died because it fits the pattern of a man who could not stop being dramatic, even right to the end. The story most people who have heard of him know is along these lines. In October 1601, Tycho went to a banquet hosted by a nobleman in Prague. He drank a lot, so naturally he needed to use the bathroom. But 16th century court etiquette said you couldn't leave the table before you're hosted. And the host didn't leave. So Tycho sat there and held it for the entire meal. He made it home, but he never recovered. He died 11 days later, reportedly in agony, from what was described as a ruptured bladder or severe uremia. Essentially, kidney failure caused by a blocked urinary tract. Ouch. He was 54 years old. For about 400 years after that, people whispered. Poison, they said. Mercury specifically. Tycho had powerful enemies. Clashed with the Danish nobility, and even had beef with Christian IV of Denmark. The timing felt suspicious to some who knew the situation. This festered over those nearly 400 years, and the whispers were still loud enough that when the 2010 team opened the tomb, settling the poison question was one of the reasons they were there, not just to find out what his nose was made of. They tested the remains for mercury and other toxins, they ran the numbers. The conclusion landed in 2012, and the mercury levels in his remains were nowhere near lethal. From the evidence that was available, signs of obvious murder just weren't there, said the research team. But for 400 years, people told themselves there must have been a conspiracy. But then modern forensics checked, and the boring answer won. Tycho Brahe, one of the greatest scientists of the Renaissance, almost certainly died because he was too polite or too proud to excuse himself at a dinner table. Tycho Brahe lost his nose in a mass argument, died because he wouldn't be rude at dinner, and left behind a brass stain on his skull that took 400 years to properly identify. Which brings us to the part of this story which I think is really beautiful. So the thing about that stain is this. It's not just a cool forensic detail, it's actually kind of an accidental self-portrait. Tycho Brahe spent his adult life managing how the world saw him. The nose was the most visible part of that. He didn't do what others did in that era, hide it under a cloth or a leather patch. He had a precision metal prosthetic crafted and painted to look like the real thing. He wanted to look like himself. And yes, you could read that as vanity. You could also read it as a man who had something taken from him and simply wanted his face back. Let's face it, it was probably both. Either way, after his death, the nose did something he had never accounted for. It left a chemical record on his skull, a record that said, here is where that object sat, and here is what it was made of. And we see this a lot with forensic history. The physical evidence left on or in a body after death can tell you a lot about what that person did, what they ate, what they were exposed to, what they cared about. It's biography written in chemistry and bone. In Tycho's case, the biography is very specific. This man carried a small box of nose glue with him every single day of his adult life, and 400 years later, the scientists who opened his tomb could read that, confirmed in brass, in a green stain on his skull. The nose is gone. The man is gone. The banquets and the pet elk and the psychic dwarf and the star charts. All of that is centuries in the past. But the copper green stain is still there, and now we know exactly what made it. Tycho Brahe's nose outlasted everything else about him, and honestly, he would have bloody loved that. But now I have a question for you. If you were exhumed in 300 years, which let's be honest is a weird thing to imagine, but let's go with it, what would the forensic evidence say about you? What stain would your hobbies leave on your bones? What would your obsessions leave behind? Gamers, would the repetitive strain show up in your finger joints? Cyclists, would your spine tell the story? People who spent 40 years hunched over a phone? Honestly, future archaeologists are going to have a lot of questions. And what about the stuff you carry with you every day? The things you use so often they become part of your routine, like say a small box of nose glue, or a modern day vape pen. Tycho's exhumation revealed a man defined by a very specific kind of pride. What would yours reveal? Put it in the comments. What weird forensic evidence would a future scientist find on your remains? Because I genuinely want to know. See you later.